In today's episode, we will be talking all about FVR, which is free voluntary reading in the world language classroom. My guest today is Jade Greene, and she's going to give us some insights and tools for creating a classroom library and inspiring reading in our students. So let's jump in. Are you a language teacher looking for some reassurance that what you're doing in the classroom is on the right track? Or maybe you're looking for some ways to teach even more effectively. If you're one or the other or somewhere in between, you've landed in the right place. This is the World Language Classroom Podcast with your host, me, Joshua Cabral. You're about to get tips, tools, and resources so that your students continue to rise in proficiency and communicate with confidence. Let's jump in. Vamos, allons-y. Hello, my friends. Bonjour, mes amis. Hola, mis amigos. We love reading and we see so much value in it. The thing about reading is so many times in the classroom, in our language classrooms, when we're reading one novel together, one story together. That typically happens in, their English language arts classes. But is there an opportunity for students to be a little more engaged in topics that are really important to them or that they identify with? So we're going to jump into this topic today of free voluntary reading. And to help us do that is the amazing Jade Greene. Welcome on in, Jade.
Yeah. Hey, y'all.
Where are you right now, Jade?
I'm in North Carolina, Greensboro.
So can you tell us about your journey in this world of teaching?
I taught Spanish for 7 years. I've taught so many different levels. I started out with Spanish 1. I did some pre-IB, IB level towards the end of my first school that I taught at. So I have experience with upper level and lower level, but I have more experience with lower level. When I first started teaching, I was so focused on teaching with a textbook because that's the way I learned in high school and that was what I knew. But the last few years of my teaching experience, I've explored CI and comprehensible input, and I am in love with making language more comprehensible for students and helping them be able to communicate in Spanish.
And what was your connection with Spanish, like throughout your education, that made you choose that as your career?
My mom, when I was in middle school, she went back to college. And she had a Spanish class because, they require you to take a language class when you're in college. So she was doing her homework, and she would always do her homework when we were around. And I was so intrigued. I was like, Spanish? Wait, like, I was only around people who spoke English. In my hometown, there wasn't a huge Spanish population, so I had no contact with other languages before. So I was like, I'm going to study this when I go to high school. And when I got to high school, I took Spanish class, fell in love even more, and then got to travel a little bit. So I fell in love with Spanish then.
So let's jump into this topic of reading. And before we talk about specifically the free voluntary reading sort of experience for students, what are the benefits that you see for promoting that culture of reading in your classroom?
Reading is important no matter the subject because it's going to help students develop a comprehension of what they're reading and vocabulary. One of the quotes that I posted to my Instagram was that students pick up word meaning 10 times faster by reading than with intensive vocabulary instruction. That was by Stephen Krashen. So students are going to pick up more vocabulary reading on their own if they're trying to make sense of it in context versus me saying you have to memorize this list of vocabulary just because I said it's for this unit. Also introduce more cultural topics with books because students are going to read about things that relate to certain cultures, and they're going to understand that better than, I would say, facts here and there about culture from a country.
So it's essentially the whole idea with comprehensible input is everything's in context, and so I guess when you're
Hmm.
reading, every single word and every single language structure is inherently in context.
Yep.
How do you choose the books that go into your library? Now, let's just actually step back from there a second. And this whole idea of free voluntary reading. Now, I kind of gave my spin on it when I introduced the topic, but how would you describe what that is before we even talk about the library?
I would say it is a time, specific times, whether you do it 2 days, 3 days, you have specific times set aside for students to read.
Hmm.
You want students to develop a love for reading, which is why the voluntary piece is there. You don't make them read a specific book, you let them choose what they want to read
Hmm.
during that time. And it's important for students to have choice
Hmm.
during this time.
Hmm. But the
I mean,
expectation is that students are reading during that time. It's not
yes.
sort of a choice of reading or not.
Oh, no, 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 no. They get a choice of which book or which, if they want to read a magazine or like the
Mhm.
piece. But
Mhm.
no, they have to read.
Okay. And how long is that period, when you sort of set out your time in class? How long does that last?
I had Spanish 1. The past few years, I've taught mostly Spanish 1. So, with Spanish 1 students, they don't have a lot of background with language. So, they need more time to develop a vocabulary, to understand those high frequency verbs. And then we started after maybe, I don't know, 4 or 5 weeks. We've worked and we've read and we've conversed a little bit and used Spanish. And if I felt like they were ready, then we could introduce free voluntary reading. But
Mhm.
when I first started with some groups of Spanish 1, I started with 3 minutes. All right, we're gonna read for
Mhm.
3 minutes, and then
Mhm.
it got to the point where, okay, we're gonna up it to 5. And what's really exciting is when students are reading and they're like, "Aw, 5 minutes is up." Yes,
That's when
it's
you struck
working.
gold, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So you can do it in increments and increase based on what
Mhm.
your students are ready for. 3, 5, 7, 5, 7, 9, 10 minutes,
Mhm.
whatever works for them.
Mhm. And typically, do students continue reading what they were reading the last time, or are they choosing new things? I guess maybe it depends on the level, but what does that typically look like?
Some students will read the same book, and some students will be bored with the book that they were reading and they can switch.
Mhm.
It would be great if students wanted to keep reading books that they were reading the last session, but it's okay if
Mhm.
students change books mid book, or even if they've only read a few
Mhm.
pages, because if you want students to develop a love for learning and you force them to read a book that they don't want to read, they're not going to want to keep, it's going to be a drag every single time. They have to, oh, well, it's free
Mhm.
voluntary reading time and I have to read this book that Profe
Mhm.
Collins is making me read.
Right. Do students reread the same book sometimes if they're really interested in it?
I haven't seen that. But
Mhm.
I've reread books before that I like.
Right.
So, I mean, it can only help because even though they're rereading it, they're going to be exposed to that vocabulary. It's frequency again. So, that
Mhm.
vocab, those verbs, all of that stuff, all of those structures are going to stick with them if they read it
Mhm.
again.
So now I'm going to go back to my original question in this section about
Okay.
how you choose your books that go into your classroom library.
I try to choose a variety of books. So, action, suspense, nonfiction, fiction, drama. Students love drama. Based on plot, and then also levels. So, I I said I've taught mostly Spanish 1, so I had a lot of books that were going to be good for novice readers. And then also there are some books that were for more advanced readers because not every student's going to be at the same level. Some students are going to retain vocabulary better, and they're going to need something a little bit more advanced to push them. So, having a variety of books.
And what's been some of your student responses that stick out to you of a book they found in your library to read in your classroom that really spoke to them? And they're sort of like, oh, Prophet Collins, that's what they call you?
Well,
Oh, they called
yeah,
you? Because you're green
yes,
now, right? But when you were
yes.
Prophet Collins, right? Oh, thank you so much for this book. This really spoke to me. Any of those experiences?
I have had students read La Clase de Confesiones by
Mm-hmm.
Alicia Quintero. And that one is
Mm-hmm.
really, really juicy. And I think students could relate to it. So I have
Mm.
had students talk about that one.
And do you try to have different representation within your classroom library for students that they're not just always sort of that window into the experience of others, but they're seeing themselves reflected as well? Is that a part of your process?
Yes, that is very important to me because a lot of the books on covers of books, you don't want to have one specific type of student. You don't want to have only representation for one skin color. You want to have representation for differently abled students. You want to make sure students feel represented.
Hmm.
If I saw a book and there was somebody on the cover that looked like me, I'd be intrigued to pick it up.
And are you finding that there are more of those options available now? I think that the world of the concept of DEI and representation is it's being recognized and understood more. And are you finding more options for representation when you're looking for these books?
I think there are some changes being made. I think that more people are going to be more aware of representation in books, um, and I'm excited to see those changes.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the well, I've written two books,
Mm-hmm.
and I want to make sure on those covers that there are going to be students who look like me and students who look like other students so they feel represented.
So let's talk about Jade the author. That was coming up next anyway. So let's how did you venture into writing these books, these readers for students?
Okay, I wanted to write. Um, I had it in my head probably way longer than I should have before I actually did it. And then I did
Mm-hmm.
write, and I sat on that book for a year at least because
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't ready to put it out there into the world. And I reached out in quarantine to Carrie
Mm-hmm.
Toth at the very, very beginning of quarantine. And I asked her some questions, and she encouraged me. Also, Alicia Quintero, and they encouraged me a lot to just go for it. And I was like, all right, I'm gonna do it. So
Mm-hmm.
I sent, I sent in, I sent in some of my book, and Carol Gobb, she read it and she liked it, and then I ended up writing another one
Mm-hmm.
because during the height of everything that was going on with George Floyd, I had like so many emotions and I wanted to get what I was feeling out in relation to the classroom and students and how they might be feeling. So that's how Sueño Hecho Realidad came to life.
Mm-hmm.
And so we
Mm-hmm.
published that one first.
So that was actually your second book that was published first
Yes.
in response to events that were happening around the country.
Yes. My
Yeah.
first book was El Duendo de Salento.
Mhm. Mhm. And
And
what's that
then
one about?
it is based on a legend, a Colombian legend. I'm pretty
Mhm.
sure there are variations of this in lots of other Spanish speaking countries. But my friend, I was looking to make a short story because I wanted something for my students to read in Spanish that was cultural. So I was like, tell me something about Colombia, like a legend or something, a story.
Mhm.
She told me that, and I sat down to write the short story, only meant to be like maybe 1 or 2 pages. And then I was like, wait,
Mhm.
there's so much. It can be a book.
Mhm.
And so I mapped out the chapters and I started writing. And then I had a book. I had the whole little novel.
So the book that you wrote for in response to Black Lives Matter, the name George Floyd that
Hmm.
was representative of so much racism in this country.
Hmm.
When you wrote that book, what level I'm assuming you wrote it in Spanish as a
Hmm.
Spanish reader, correct? So
Hmm.
when you were writing that book, what was the level of Spanish that you were writing there for, like, sort of what level of middle school or high school?
Mm, I wouldn't say middle school or high school. I would say level of Spanish. So for a student
Right.
who's had a couple years of Spanish, I think they could definitely, or even in year 2 of Spanish, I think that they could
Mhm.
definitely dive into the book. Especially even if a student were in 8th grade or ninth or 10th grade, I think those things that were written in Sueño, Hecho Realidad,
Mhm.
students are going to be able to relate to because I'm sure it's happened to them or somebody that they know
Mhm.
in some form or fashion.
So many times these discussions that need to be happening in the classroom, and students need to see, if this book shows up in my teacher's library, it's because they recognize this is important, that this
Hmm.
is an option for me. And I ask specifically about the level because these these ideas don't have to be at the intermediate, high, advanced level of
Mm-mm.
proficiency to engage these conversations. So you're sort of writing it at an intermediate low, sort of connected sentences
Hmm.
realm of proficiency, and teachers and students can grapple with those topics at that level.
Even if a lower level student were to attempt, because they want to challenge themselves, all of the novels, the comprehension based readers have glossaries in the back of every single word.
So let's kind of flip a little bit and talk about your inspiration. We have lots of information, which is great. And I love listeners to hear about what inspires you so that they could maybe look into those things as well. So, where does your inspiration come from? Are there conferences, books, or people out there that inspire you?
I get inspiration for, you mean for resources, for books, for
Anything that makes you get up and say, "I'm gonna do an even better job today than yesterday."
I watch a lot of
Mhm.
TV. I watch Spanish Spanish soap operas. That's
Mhm.
my jam. So a lot of the cultural things that I see there, I try to incorporate things that I learned there, especially
Mhm.
vocabulary, representation. I love to make sure that in my resources and clip art that I use, that students are represented. I use students with different skin tones. I use students that are differently abled, wheelchairs. I use students with
Mhm.
hijabs. So representation is really important to me.
Okay, so now we're gonna take a little breather, and we are gonna
Okay.
pull. Yeah, take a deep breath. We're gonna pull back the teacher curtain a little bit and get to know Jade
Okay.
the person, who I
Okay.
I quite enjoy getting to know Jade the person, because you're a pretty cool person, I have to say. Um, uh, and so I'm gonna ask you a couple of either or questions, and sometimes these come from
Okay.
my Twitter followers that kind of put it out there. Here's some good either or
Hmm.
questions. Okay, no right or wrong answer.
Okay.
You might say a little bit about why, but these are just to get to know you a little bit. So, first one: city or country?
I am gonna say
Mhm.
city because I grew up in a small town, and that is not having anything to
Mm-hmm.
do is no fun. So I don't have to be in a big city. Like Greensboro is not
Mm-hmm.
super big, but it's not like Charlotte huge. So I'm gonna go with city.
All righty. Okay. Okay. Next one here. Digital or paper book?
Paper book.
Mm.
Paper book.
I'm so with
I
you on that one.
I have read digital books just because, availability, but
Mm-hmm.
I prefer to turn the pages. There's nothing
Mm-hmm.
like turning pages or opening a brand new
Mm-hmm.
book. I love it. And it has a
Oh.
smell, like the new book smell.
Oh, the new book smell. Yeah. And the last either or here. Plan it or just wing it?
uh, I am a
Mm-hmm.
little bit of both. So I plan things, but I don't plan it with bullet points for every
Mm-hmm.
single minute. So like I can plan and say, okay, I'm gonna do
Mm-hmm.
this today, and then wing it if I need to change things up based on my mood or students' mood. So I'm a little bit of both.
So you're flexible. You remain flexible.
Yes, I'm
Yes,
flexible.
that's important. It has been an absolute joy talking with you today, hearing all about the reading and the literature that you inspire in your students, and to hear about your author journey and all of that. And if our listeners would like to connect with you, where can they find you?
Instagram, that's where you're going to find me the most.
Mm-hmm.
And then I also have Twitter. I
Mm-hmm.
occasionally make an appearance on Twitter.
What's your Instagram handle?
La Secundaria underscore JAG. And
Mm-hmm.
then for Twitter, it is La Secundaria JAG. And then I do have a Facebook page too. It's La Secundaria.
Okay, la secundaria. That's
La
your thing.
Secundaria. That's
That's
it.
always been your thing. You've been la secundaria. La secundaria. Well, thank you so much for spending this time with me.
All right. Bye.
You may have noticed in my conversation with Jade about free voluntary reading is that we did not have a discussion about checking for understanding or having students report out on what they read or having some sort of book report or log of what they read. And the reason for that is the whole concept of free voluntary reading is that we want to instill a love of reading and an enjoyment of learning about a topic of interest without being accountable for a grade. When we ask students to report out on things, yes, there is some value in that. Absolutely, that happens in classrooms all the time, and for good reason. But the goal of free voluntary reading is for it to be a choice and to show students that they are able to use their language and learn. And it's really important that we have lots of options for students when it comes to choosing books. And that way, if it's something they want to read about, then they will be drawn to it and have more interest in it. So I appreciated the insights that Jade gave us about starting with smaller amount of times with beginner students and having longer amounts of times as they move on. And also that representation piece, which is incredibly important for students so that they are drawn towards books where, yes, they will learn, but also see themselves reflected. So be sure to check out the show notes so you can connect with Jade as well, Jade Greene. You will see a link to sign up for Talking Points, my weekly newsletter where you will get tips on language teaching during the week, and you'll know when new episodes are published and it's time to listen. We will talk again real soon. Bye for now. You've been listening to the World Language Classroom podcast. Be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you don't miss a single episode. Let's continue the conversation on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram at WL Classroom. You can also see over 250 blog posts about language teaching at, you guessed it, WLClassroom.com.